Good afternoon, everybody. It is Friday, October 2nd, 2020, 32 days before the November 3rd presidential election. I'm Keir Murray. I'm joined by my dad, Richard Murray, UH political scientist, and we once a week are getting together to talk about all events political, and there's lots to talk about. Slow news week, as we say in the business. So the last time we met, of course, we're talking a lot about the passing of Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, what that might mean, both for nomination and eventual confirmation of her successor. President Trump did, of course, nominate Judge Amy Coney Barrett to succeed her. That confirmation process is supposed to proceed over the next few weeks for reasons we'll discuss shortly. We'll see what happens with that. So she was nominated, I believe, on Saturday. On Sunday, we got word from the New York Times that they'd obtained President Trump's tax returns going back a number of years. On Tuesday night, we had the first presidential debate, which I think most observers described as the most unusual they'd ever seen. And then, of course, last night, the disclosure by President Trump that both he and his wife, Melania, have tested positive for COVID-19, upending campaign events and potentially the upcoming debates as well, headed into the last 4 weeks of the campaign. So a remarkable turn of events, to say the least. Let's start with the last thing we discussed, which is probably top of mind for most people, and this COVID-19 disclosure by the president. What does it mean for the race and, for his campaign and the American public as we head into early voting, which has already begun in a number of states?
Well, we several times stressed that compared to previous presidential campaigns, the race in terms of polling has been remarkably stable. That once Biden had secured the Democratic nomination in March, April, started to raise money, and then that he opened up a not huge but substantial lead in the total vote nationally, but also a lead in most of the battleground states. And that's been the pattern for 4 months. Despite all of these rather momentous events, none of them have really moved the needle very much. We've had, these three major things since the death of Justice Ginsburg that you noted: the disclosure of the president's financial matters, the debate, which was chaotic to say the least, and now the infection of both the president and the first lady. So the stability thesis is really being tested here, particularly because, Joe Biden has tried, for obvious reasons, to make the virus and the president's response to it the centerpiece of his argument for why the president needs to be replaced. And of course, the president has largely tried to consistently downplay the virus and shift the attention to first viruses. Biden's personal characteristics that Trump, of course, has criticized very strongly, and to shift on to other topics like law and order. Well, this is, I think, got to be a devastating blow for the president in that regard, because when you're and your wife and a whole bunch, it looks like, of people that are very close, like the head of the Republican National Committee, your aide, Hope Hicks, have this virus. I mean, how do you say this is overblown? It seems to me, whatever the sort of, it's all a hoax crowd that's still left. This is such a powerful event that cannot be ignored, that it not only takes the president off the campaign trail and his plan for the next 2 or 3 weeks, but just sort of knocks this whole strategy of, well, this is overblown, it's not as big as ever. Now, there's no way of saying that.
Well, my instinct is that the political reaction to this development, like everything else, is largely just going to fall along people's previously existing partisan or ideological lines, right? Like, people who like the president will be sympathetic toward him and Melania if he recovers quickly, as we hope they do from the virus. They'll say, well, look, it wasn't so bad, just like he's been saying. They'll be sympathetic toward him. For those who are not supportive of the president, they're going to say this is an example of his recklessness and not taking this seriously. I guess I'm curious to know, do you think, does this development really change anything, or is it just more of the same?
I think it's mostly more of the same, but that's very bad news for the president. He needs to change the arc of the race, and I cannot see that net effectiveness is going to do that. If we're correct and it just largely locks things in place, well, that's not where the president needs this race to be going. And particularly because he had counted on a series of closing rallies that would energize his campaign. And maybe some of that can be resumed, but that's very, very questionable. It also tends, it seems to me, to validate the Biden campaign's whole approach of let's be very, very careful, individually and for everybody around, so that we're not going to expose very many people. So, one of the things I haven't seen the final numbers, but the huge financial advantage that Biden had begun to open up after the 1st of August has, I think, accelerated. That the Biden campaign continues to raise unprecedented amounts of money. I understand in the hour on the East Coast between 10 and 11 o'clock Tuesday night during the debate, that the money was simply pouring in at a rate Act Blue, the clearinghouse that Democratic and progressive candidates rely on, at a rate they'd never seen. So, you and I know well that plenty of candidates spend more money than their opponents and lose. But in a close race down the stretch, especially with a complexity of a presidential race with so many different potential state targets, 12 or 13 or 14, you sure would rather beat the candidate that has a clear financial advantage, which it now seems certain is going to be the case for the Biden campaign for the next 32 days.
And before we leave the COVID-19 crisis, or the development with the president, I want to ask what you think about its potential impact in the short term on the confirmation process for Judge Barrett. She's been making the rounds over the last week or so with, I think, mostly Republican senators on the Hill. I read, which I did not know beforehand, that she and her husband had already previously had COVID-19 in the spring or a few months ago. But we saw Senator Mike Lee from Utah announce today that he's tested positive for the virus, and reading some speculation that even some Republican senators are, trying to prevail on Mitch McConnell to slow this process down to protect the health and safety of senators and their staffs and otherwise. Do you think this will derail or slow down the confirmation process for Judge Barrett?
Mitch McConnell stopped returning my calls several weeks ago. He generally doesn't act until he's sort of felt out his conference. It increases the likelihood for sure that you can't get this done before November 3rd. But it's hard to put a percentage number on that. I think that before these last few days, that it was probably a 60 to 80% that the justice would be confirmed, the judge would be confirmed and become a justice of the court before November 3rd. That has to be lower now. I think it's maybe, 30, 40, 50%, but a pretty good likelihood that it can't be done because, this is pretty darn serious business with a lot of people in the Republican campaign apparatus now already diagnosed, another senator. This doesn't look like a great time to be hurry, hurry, hurry. Let's get this done in an unprecedented fashion this late in a presidential campaign.
And thinking about the Senate, we've seen, obviously, in addition to the presidency in November, control of the Senate is a big item up for the fight. Reading in the last few days that Mitch McConnell and his allies are beginning to move money to states like Kansas and Alaska, states that they previously, I think would have felt pretty comfortable about their folks winning. You know, my experience is in those cases, you don't spend money unless you think you need to. What's your sense of how the battle for the Senate is shaping up and how these developments with COVID and everything, debate and everything else might affect those prospects?
Well, the impartial observers like the Cook Report and Wasserman had made the Democrats a modest favorite to take control of the Senate about 10 days ago or 2 weeks. And I think that those odds have increased. It's pretty clear that the field is broadening, even here in Texas. MJ Hager raised a surprisingly strong amount of money. She's up on television now at a much more competitive pace. So Mike Espy in Mississippi was not thought to be a candidate that had much of a shot. He had lost, this is a rematch of a race he lost 2 years ago. But recent polling shows that that margin is also quite tight. So we now have still the usual situation on the Democratic side. Doug Jones in Alabama is considered to be, if not a goner in a race that's very tough to win, so a likely Democratic loss there. Senator Peters in Michigan, the other most vulnerable Democrat, looks to have a pretty stable lead. So all the new play is in the Republican seats, particularly in states below the radar like Alaska, which is a quirky state that's been hard hit by the virus. And I think a good bit of money is poured into the independent candidate who is the Democratic contender there, Dr. Gross. So, I just think partly because of the exposure, Republicans could now lose potentially 10 or 11 seats in the Senate, very likely going to lose 2 or 3. And, Democrats are in a better position than last week to lock down a Senate majority.
I want to shift back, moving backwards in time a little bit to the, many moons ago of Tuesday night and the first presidential debate. As you mentioned, a very combative affair. I don't think I'm, saying anything radical by in characterizing it as a disaster. I think that's how most viewers and analysts saw it. Viewership was far lower than the presidential first debate in 2016. And my own suspicion is, based on the way the first 10 or 15 minutes went, you had a lot of folks that tuned in and left. It was a pretty ugly affair. Lots of interrupting and crosstalk. The moderator struggled, Chris Wallace, to maintain control of the proceedings. What's your read on the debate or the fallout from it, if there is any, and what effect, if any, it has on the race?
Well, in my judgment, it did not change the trajectory of the race, and that's good for Biden. He's ahead. He's on a track to win by all the standards of conventional measurement of how races are going. More money, better polling in the battleground states, better polling overall. And I don't think, again, the numbers change much. The people are with Trump, as we've seen ever since he talked about shooting somebody on Fifth Avenue. They're with him. But that's not large enough to win. And particularly if the key target, as we keep reading and hearing, and I think is in fact the reality, is that suburban women are the most critical constituency, particularly women that historically leaned Republican. But, I was over in River Oaks this morning speaking to a ladies group, and I read the stats for the 2 precincts closest to the club. That's, I think, 135 and 217. And how much better Mitt Romney ran in those precincts, winning them with about 75, 78% of the vote versus Trump 4 years ago, winning, but like 55%, a 20-something% drop, and probably losing a lot of that in this round. And, that's sort of the epitome of upscale Republican leaning area with an awful lot of female voters. So I don't think the debate helped Trump, and every day that passes, now that we're really about to start voting in earnest, already in Virginia, North Carolina, and Wisconsin, lots of votes have been cast. And so this is getting, October surprises. Well, we got one, here on the second day of October, but as with the virus, it's hard to see how this redounds to the benefit of the incumbent president.
Do you think the two scheduled next presidential debates will happen?
No. First, the public isn't clamoring for more debates, I think. I think the vice presidential debate will likely go off, and that's very consequential because, that's scheduled pretty soon. They apparently are both not positive. But, the next vice president has a probably way above 50% chance of being the 46th president of the United States. And these are normal politicians who will not engage in the kind of food fight that we saw a couple of days ago. So I think a good many voters, even though it's for the number 2 position and historically that doesn't drive many votes, this one I think will be a little different. We may be looking again at the next president of the United States after, the current contenders move on from the scene.
Yeah, I mean, before we leave the debate, I'll just one note I thought is sort of remarkable to me, and I've commented on this before, but I thought Chris Wallace gave the president a couple of opportunities to, he lobbed some softballs over the plate. In particular, the one that got a lot of attention was just asking him to denounce white supremacy, which I think most people thought he did not clearly do. Just seemed like a pretty basic and huge missed opportunity for him to just make a common sense statement that almost any candidate would make, and he didn't do it. I'm curious as to why, other than sort of trying to keep a base of people riled up. Do you read anything into it, or is it just in a pattern of the same pattern of conduct we've seen from him over the years?
Well, I keep repeating Michael Gerson's line about Trump, W. Bush's speechwriter and Republican operative, that for Trump, time is only the immediate present. There is no past and no future, and no kind of plan that he can follow in a disciplined fashion. He just is a bundle of emotional reactions. And for whatever reasons, he's found it very difficult to condemn virtually anybody that he thinks is for him for whatever reason, whether it's North Korea or the Proud Boys or the folks in Charlottesville 3 years ago. I think from the perspective of most of us that have followed politics, this may be emotionally satisfying, but it's pretty damn dumb. And again, these were softballs that normally, anybody would whack out of the park, but Trump can't get beyond this kind of, if they like me, I can't say anything bad about them. And there we are.
Yeah. So I think it's pretty clear based on what you've said, what most people see looking at the race, that as it stands, the president is behind in the race, both nationally and in most, if not all, of these critical battleground states. In addition, I think he's got some new fronts like Ohio and potentially Texas and Georgia, where, again, he may be not as assured of victory as his folks once thought. Given the fact that he is at a financial deficit with Biden, given the fact that the subsequent 2 debates, which would attract a lot of public attention, are at best questionable as to whether or not they will occur, and probably won't occur under a live setting. It'd be a virtual setting if they do occur. And given the fact that now diagnosed with COVID-19 will necessarily restrict his ability to campaign in person over the next few weeks at least, how does he change this race? That really is the question. Can he, and if so, how does he change the race?
Well, there's prayer, but beyond that, I don't know that anybody could suggest anything that would have some reasonable, you hope your opponent stumbles, but Biden, again, has been one of the luckiest guys in the history of politics for the last 7 or 8 months. And, he can now have, he's not going to have to be perhaps out as aggressively campaigning, and that cuts down on the opportunity for gaffes or misstatements. The money's going to keep pouring in. Wall Street likes a winner, and I think that's what they see now in the Democratic nominee. And And Biden has shown, after raising very little money from small donors, that there are millions of people out there, probably largely driven by animus toward Trump and his recent antics, that are writing checks like crazy. And so you got the combination that really generates an incredible amount of cash, millions of small donors, plus the big investor types that figure out, well, like it's interesting that the U.S. Chamber of Commerce endorsed 25, 26 freshman Democratic members. That's a hedge bet.
Including Lizzie Fletcher here in Houston and Colin Allred in Dallas.
This is a group that, particularly since Scott Reed came over, a longtime Republican operative, I think he was critical in the Bob Dole campaign in '96, had been stalwartly supporting Republicans. This time around, they largely have sat out the Senate races. They dropped a little money into Maine and a couple other places the other day, but to endorse 25 Democratic House members, again, total hedge bet.
And I noted Mr. Reed has parted company with the chamber as of a couple of days ago. Very, very interesting. And I will say regarding the debate and Biden being lucky, I agree, because I thought the president's behavior obscured a pretty poor performance by Biden that under different circumstances would have cost him more. He inaccurately described his own healthcare program, just didn't seem sharp as far as I'm concerned, but I just don't think it mattered because I think, his opponent in the debate so overshadowed things and not in a beneficial way for himself that I don't think most people remember anything about what Joe Biden did in that debate. But that's for another matter. I guess then if you can't change the race materially, we're left with potentially questioning the validity of the results, which is another tack we've seen in advance the president begin to pursue. What do you think about that and its prospects for getting the kind of outcome he wants?
Well, he's made it quite clear this is a very real option. It's a dangerous option, I think, both for the long-term future of democracy in America. We've never had a presidential candidate in the midst of a campaign that basically is saying, if I lose, the election is rigged. I mean, Trump said that every now and then, but people kind of laughed it off in 2016. I don't think anybody's laughing in 2020. But it can have short-term electoral downside bigger than a lot of people. I don't think are going to say, oh, I'm going to vote for this guy because he's not going to leave office even if he loses. But I think some voters, the civic duty, good government types that may lean Republican, this would give them more of an incentive to try to ensure that this can't happen by a Biden landslide, which is now, I think, increasingly likely. It seems to me the range of options in the election as it plays out over the next 4 weeks is that Trump might figure out a way to narrowly duplicate his win in the Electoral College while losing the popular vote by not 3 million, but by 5 or 6. That's possible, but quite unlikely. More likely now is that Biden wins a substantial victory and possibly even a landslide. Because the way elections break out at the end is it's the people that are hanging back and not voting, they usually don't split 50-50. And if you get a decided drift in the last 3 or 4 days, which is not pollable, it's too close to the election, that produces a landslide. And that's what happened with Reagan in 1980. And so that's another reason that, again, Biden, just by the fact that he's got plenty of money and there's no pressure on him to campaign much in person now, can get the great majority of these late deciders. And there's very little interest in a third option this time around, third party or independent candidate. So then that would likely take the Senate and also an awful lot of state legislative seats around the country, because we become a largely straight ticket voting country. Whether you have the option of a straight ticket on your ballot or not, you can still go down and find everybody from one party or the other.
And that's a good segue into Texas. We've noted over the weeks and months that polling shows the presidential race in Texas remains stubbornly close. I've not seen any polls where president had any more than a lead of a couple of points, some where he's trailed by a few points, but most essentially showing it tied in the state. As we know, the voter registration deadline closes on Monday, October 5th. So the last few registrants will be, getting their papers in. I think we're going to end up somewhere between 16 and a half and 17 million. How close to 17 we get, we'll see. What do you think about Texas overall, top of the ticket? We've talked about this every week, but I just want to know if your thinking is shifted on that any.
No, I saw the Secretary of State put out a new statewide total. It looked to me like it was about 16,670,000. That's about 1.6 million more registered persons in Texas than in November 4 years ago in the race between Hillary Clinton and Joe Biden. So we've added a good many folks. And we had a little less than 10 million vote, but a lot of them didn't vote for Trump or Clinton in 2016, and we won't have that this time. So it looks like to me we're headed to probably at least 11 million people voting, and probably more than that. And I think that's one of the reasons there's some panic on the Republican side, and the pressure on the governor to shut down all the multiple ballot return locations. I think we had 11 in Harris County. Now we're back down to 1 at NRG, because the bottom line is if you have a high turnout, the risk to the dominant Republican Party increases substantially. They've been winning with low turnout. High turnout creates a lot more risk, not just of losing even the presidential race, but your Senate race and losing control of the legislature, particularly in the state house. So I think we'll probably end up with about 16.8 million. I think we'll add another 120,000. It takes a while to process ballots. So we keep adding people to the voter rolls all the way up to the 3rd of November. So that's a pretty substantial increase in registration. The places that are allowing voting are seeing a surge, like Virginia. And I think that's one of the reasons that pressure again was put on the governor to pull back. Let's pull away those 6 extra days of early voting, in-person early voting, and go back to whatever October 19th, I guess, was the original scheduled date. But if people want to vote, and whatever the rules, most of them will get to the polls. The problem in elections is a lot of people don't care to vote, and you can't drive them. But this looks like an election where the American public thinks it's important. 70% of people are telling pollsters this is the most important election of my lifetime. And we're seeing again in Virginia and North Carolina, very, very robust turnout 35 days before, quote, the election day.
Yeah, and I want to talk about the sort of proceedings going on in Texas a little bit. On July 27th, Governor Abbott issued an order extending early voting an extra 6 days in person and facilitating hand delivery of mail ballots in the state. And his stated rationale in the order was to protect against the spread of COVID-19 and facilitate voting by mail and in person for Texans while doing that. And as you noted yesterday, we got word that he had rescinded some of those delivery options for hand delivery for mail ballots. And there has been since some speculation that he might rescind his own order, lengthening the early voting period. I will note that his consultant, Dave Carney, poured water on that on social media, saying it was a Democrat rumor and it was not true, et cetera. But in addition to that, there's litigation that's before the Texas Supreme Court right now that Dr. Hotze here in the Houston area and some others filed that would compel the state, or asking the state Supreme Court to rescind that early voting, among other things. Clock is ticking here. We're less than 2 weeks away from the scheduled beginning of early in-person voting. And complicating that factor, it seems to me, in addition, is that 4 of the 9 state Supreme Court justices who would ostensibly rule on this are themselves on the ballot in November, and all have Democratic opponents, and some, I think, third-party opponents as well. So how do you read this situation? The governor looks like is being squeezed from both sides. The hard right faction of his party is very unhappy with his management of the COVID-19 crisis, feels he's been draconian, too much clamping down on Texans, closing of businesses, that sort of thing. And on the other hand, his public standing with more middle of the road Texans has fallen as we've suffered health and economic consequences. And do you think the governor will take that next step? And B, what do you think the Supreme Court does?
I don't know. I think he's kind of jammed here. It's late in the day to reverse a pretty important decision with the pandemic raging on, not getting any better. That's a very risky move to make. Obviously, it opens the governor up to being a flip-flopper, and he's got to run a year from now. We'll open up the race for governor in Texas, and he's going to be probably first having to fight his way through a Republican primary, which he's not had really to do in his own career. He kind of got an easy ride to the AG and then the governor's job. So he's got a lot of political problems. Mr. Carney's earning his money as his consultant. And these are, no matter which option he takes, he's got a lot of political risk. Again, he hasn't consulted me lately, but I would say with Carney, I'd stick with what he's done, because if it looks like you're making a decision for your own political needs and appease a hardline fringe element within your own party, that is not going to play very well in a state where the general elections are increasingly the effective election of Texas.
And what about the Supreme Court justices? I mean, it's a 9-member court. 4 of them are on the ballot. So you could see a scenario where 4 of them say, I'm abstaining, or I'm even voting no. You still potentially have 5 votes. All 9 justices are Republican that could just do this anyway. What do you think about those prospects?
I have no idea. I assume they have professional consultants. They don't have a lot of money usually, but they probably have some access to polling data. I'll watch with great interest. Democrats haven't won a Supreme Court race in a quarter century, but it came fairly close in 2018 with a lower turnout midterm election. So at one extreme, you could have a sweep of the court by Democratic candidates. It's going to be a party line vote for the Supreme Court. People know nothing virtually at all about the individual candidates. But we live in interesting times, so I'll watch with interest what these ladies and gentlemen on the Supreme Court choose to do.
And let's talk about that. I think, again, we've talked about the presidential race likely being close in Texas. I think most people would stipulate that it could go either way, but it's going to be close. What about down ballot statewide races? John Cornyn, MJ Hager, that's a high profile race for United States Senate. Television's being run. But once you get below that, railroad commissioner and the Supreme Court races, Court of Criminal Appeals races we talked about, these are low profile races where there's not a lot of money spent. Most Texans don't know much, if anything, about these candidates. How much difference do you think there's going to be between the top of the ticket statewide and some of these other statewide races underneath?
Despite the absence of straight ticket voting option at the top, I think this will be a very straight ticket vote election behaviorally. We'll probably see 1 or 2% roll off in the U.S. Senate race. That virtually everybody that votes for president will also vote the Senate. We've got a whole bunch of contested congressionals. About 40% of the voters in the state live in hotly contested congressional districts. That's the third line on the ballot below, President Senate. I think as you go farther down, you'll get a gradual drop off to maybe 10 or 12% skipping, and then a tick back up in some important local races like sheriff or DA, county commissioner, that while way down the ballot have somewhat more visibility with voters because they have jobs that people know something about. So I think this, we join the majority of states now without the straight ticket option, but I think most voting will be in this election unusually straight ticket. So I don't think we're going to see a big difference between people running down ballot and the top of the ticket. You live or die with Trump. And that's true for Cornyn and Hager and the congressional Republicans and Democrats that are in these tight races.
Okay. Well, I think, I want to encourage everybody, if you have a question, please put it in the chat and we'll try to get to it. We've got one here. Someone says, could the talk of the president having COVID possibly be a hoax? And is it an attempt to get him sympathy or provide himself with an excuse for losing? Any thoughts on that?
Well, I'm not a big fan of conspiracy theories, particularly that would entail having a lot of people in the loop, like medical personnel who run tests. This would be a very, very interesting ploy, but I think highly, highly unlikely, because generally the short-term impact is not helpful to the president. But again, that's the main problem with conspiracies is, yeah, they can work in the short run, like the guys that killed Caesar 2,000 years ago, but they almost immediately splintered thereafter. But the classic conspiracy theories simply require a level of coordination and secrecy that cannot almost be sustained. So they're usually fringe ideas with a lot of nutso anti-Semitic elements and so on, that don't stand up on careful analysis, like the QAnon conspiracy ideas that are floating around in 2020. But yeah, this would be a real curveball if Trump's faked a diagnosis of the COVID-19 virus and got the first lady to join in, and the chair of the Republican National Committee and staffer Hope Hicks. I'll take the more straightforward and likely deal. They've got the virus.
Okay. Someone asks for Biden to carry Texas, what does the vote in Harris County have to look like for that to be possible?
I think to win in Harris County and influence the state result enough to get Biden over the top, that you don't need the 200,000 vote margin that Beto had in 2018 when he fell about 200 and something thousand short. You need over a 300,000 vote margin in Harris County. So that's the number to watch. If you can get the Democratic margin up, and Democrats are going to carry the county, that's not in any question. There's just not enough white voters left in our county to hold on for Republicans countywide. But if you can get the Democratic margin up to a 300,000, that takes away half the entire margin that Cruz won by statewide. So, you want to watch the overall ballot. The last presidential election, you had about 1.3 million people vote in the county. The Democrats need to vote in the county to be at least a total of 1.5 million. And they need that to be so that they get a split of about, 900,000 to 600,000. That gives you a margin that brings the state within reach. The Democratic margins in Dallas County, Travis County, Bexar County are going to increase, and Democrats probably carry Tarrant County again. Beto narrowly carried it. But equally important, besides the Democratic margins, they've got to run them up because they're going to get crushed out in most of the rural counties, is the big suburban counties. And as I keep touting, watched Collin County. Cruz carried it 52-48. That's by far the lowest margin of any Democrat since Lloyd Benson was running. And it's just a fast-growing county with huge increases in Asian Indian voters who might notice the number 2 on the Democratic ticket. Her Kamala is a Tamil name from South India, or Tamil, I guess.
And what about Fort Bend? What do you think? What do you think happens there?
I think for the first time in modern history, Hillary Clinton carried the county by about 20,000 votes. Beto basically doubled that. I think the Democrats need a margin out there of 50 to 60,000. It's going to be a Democratic county, but in these counties, the whole deal is what's your margin? How much do you net out of the county? North Brazoria County, again, is in rapid transition. It's going to be probably about a 50-50. Brazoria County will vote Republican, but the north end is becoming significantly more Democratic. So Republicans will not get their usual margin out of Brazoria. Galveston's getting a little closer, but still a Republican county. But the Republicans need to really roll up their margin in our metro area in Montgomery County. That's the one place where they can get a big vote lead out. They're going to lose the metro area total, but if you can, get 100,000 vote advantage out of Montgomery County, it keeps the damage down.
And lastly, and this is a question I'm sorry I missed on the chat from last week. What about the 7th Congressional District? Wesley Hunt versus freshman Democrat Lizzie Fletcher.
Well, I think Fletcher won over John Culberson, the 8-term incumbent or 9-term incumbent, but about 5% advantage, 20,000 votes roughly. But the district is getting less friendly. The west side of the district is becoming much more heavily minority. Minorities are not much inclined to vote for Trump. So my guess is that given the endorsement of the Chronicle, the Chamber of Commerce coming on board, Fletcher having plenty of money, and the National Party wading in, tying the very attractive Republican candidate Wesley Hunt to Trump, that I look for Lizzie Fletcher to win the race by 8 or 9 points, or roughly double her margin of victory 2 years ago.
Okay. Well, interesting. Well, all right. I think that we're going to wrap it for today with that. Thanks, Dad, for joining us. Thank you all for joining us today. I will post this on my YouTube channel. If you search Murray Men on Politics on YouTube, and Debbie usually sends the link around if you want to direct those who weren't able to be with us. And let's hope for a less eventful week between now and next week. Thanks, everybody, and see you soon.
Thank you.